Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the real story behind T.D. Jakes, a story that's still unfolding. South Charleston, West Virginia. June 9th, 1957. A baby boy named Thomas Dexter Jakes entered a world already stacked against him. His father, Ernest, ran a janitorial business. His mother, Odith, taught school. They lived in a struggling black neighborhood where money was tight, opportunities were rare, and racism was everywhere. Thomas was the youngest of three. He had a lisp so heavy that classmates laughed at him. Teachers doubted him. Nobody thought this boy with the broken speech would ever stand in front of a crowd. But deep down, he wanted exactly that. Every day, young Thomas preached to stuffed animals lined up on his bed. Sometimes he'd take it outside, speaking to trees in the backyard like they were his congregation. Kids called him Bible Boy. He didn't care. He was practicing for something bigger. But just as that fire was beginning to glow, tragedy struck. At only 10 years old, Thomas watched his father's health collapse. Kidney failure. No money for the best care. Slowly, painfully, his dad faded. Thomas became more than a boy. He became a caretaker, cooking, cleaning, helping his mother, watching the strongest man he knew grow weaker each day. By 16, his father was gone. The loss crushed the family, emotionally and financially. But inside Thomas, it forged steel. He had no choice but to become a man before his time. And in that furnace of grief, the calling on his life grew louder. He didn't just want to quote scripture, he wanted to bleed it. But destiny doesn't come without a price. And Thomas Jakes was about to find out just how much it would cost. In 1981, at a revival in Beckley, West Virginia, Thomas met Sarita James. She was strong, beautiful, and scarred by her own tragedies. Her brother had been murdered. She had survived abusive relationships. Yet, when she heard Jakes preach, something happened. Within 6 months, they were married. It wasn't a fairy tale beginning. They were broke. Sarita worked nights as a Christian radio DJ. Thomas preached wherever he could. Bills piled up, and then, just half a year into their marriage, disaster hit. A car crash shattered Sarita's legs and feet. Doctors said she might never walk again. But Thomas refused to let her give up. Night after night, he held her up, helped her take painful steps, taught her to walk again. That struggle sealed their bond. She became more than his wife. She became his partner in ministry. In 1980, at just 23 years old, Jakes opened his first church, 10 people in a tiny storefront. Winters were freezing, summers blistering. Sometimes they didn't even have money for food, but still, he preached. He worked shifts at the chemical plant. He dug ditches for $100 a day. When the lights went out, they lit candles. When water was cut off, they borrowed bottles from family. Through it all, he preached. From a storefront with 10 people, he dreamed of something that would one day shake America. And soon, the world would begin to notice. By the mid-1980s, Jakes had a tiny congregation, but a fire that couldn't be hidden. In 1983, he risked $45 to buy a 30-minute radio slot. His new program, Back to the Bible, carried his voice across small towns in West Virginia. Suddenly, people who would never set foot in his church were leaning in, listening. He didn't sound polished. He sounded real, empathetic, strong. In 1988, he connected with Bishop Sherman Watkins, who became a mentor and gave him access to a larger platform. That mentorship would catapult him forward. By the early 1990s, Jakes was filling rooms far bigger than any storefront. In Cross Lanes, his church drew over 2,100 members, and 40% of them were white. For a black Pentecostal pastor in a mostly white suburb, that was unheard of. He was breaking barriers. Then came the moment that changed everything: television. The Potter's Touch launched in 1993. Suddenly, Jakes wasn't just a local preacher. He was a national voice. Within 3 years, he moved to Dallas and founded the Powerhouse. Not a storefront, a megachurch, 30,000 members, tens of thousands tuning in online. But it wasn't just preaching that made T.D. Jakes a household name. Hollywood was about to come knocking. By the mid-1990s, Jakes wasn't just in the pulpit. He was building an empire. Books, music, conferences. Then came the big leap, film. In 2004, his production company released Woman, Thou Art Loosed. It was a box office hit. More films followed. Jumping the Broom, Heaven is for Real. His book sold over 20 million copies. His company brought in an estimated $400 million. He was no longer just Bible boy. He was a bishop with the ear of presidents, a mogul shaping culture, and a businessman who could move millions. When Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans in 2005, Jakes stood beside President George W. Bush, urging America to address poverty head-on. When Barack Obama was sworn in, Jakes was in the prayer circle. He wasn't just preaching anymore. He was influencing history. But with power comes scrutiny, and soon, Jakes's name would be tied to headlines no pastor ever wants to see. April 2023. T.D. Jakes signed a deal with Wells Fargo worth up to $1 billion. Money for overlooked neighborhoods, grants for HBCUS, investments in clean energy. Some praised it as groundbreaking. Others raised eyebrows. Was a preacher becoming too close to Wall Street? Then the whispers turned darker. In 2024, a lawsuit against Sean Diddy Combs mentioned Jakes' name, not as an accused, but as a man Diddy supposedly wanted to use to clean up his image. One mention was all it took. Blogs exploded. Speculation ran wild. Then came October. A convicted sex offender named Dwayne Youngblood appeared on YouTube, accusing Jakes of misconduct back in the 1980s. His demand? $6 million, or he'd sue. Jakes fired back, calling it extortion. By November, he filed a defamation lawsuit. But the stress was building. And then, the unthinkable happened. One Sunday morning in front of thousands, T.D. Jakes' body gave out, live on stage. November 24th, 2024, the Potter's House in Dallas. Thousands filled the sanctuary. Thousands more tuned in online. Bishop Jakes was preaching with fire until suddenly his hand dropped the microphone. His body slumped. He fell. It looked like exhaustion. It was worse, a massive heart attack. Doctors later said he was 5 minutes from death. Half his heart had stopped, and yet he kept preaching until his body gave out. Jakes later described leaving his body, seeing clouds, silence, peace. He called it a privilege, a spiritual moment that made him rethink everything. And that moment pushed him toward a decision no one saw coming. The man who built the Potter's House would hand it to the very child critics once said had ruined her future. On April 27, 2025, in front of the congregation he built from nothing, Bishop Jakes made the announcement. His daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, and her husband Tay would take over as senior pastors of the Potter's House. For Sarah, it was full circle. At 14, she had been a single mother, a scandal in the church world. But instead of destroying her, it became her testimony. She built Woman Evolve, a movement empowering women everywhere. And now, the keys of a 30,000-member megachurch were placed in her hands. Jakes made it clear he wasn't retiring. "This is not a departure," he said. "It's a rebirth." The Potter's House was entering a new era. The daughter, once doubted by many, was now leading one of the largest congregations in America. But if history tells us anything, T.D. Jakes' story is far from over, and what's hidden behind the headlines may still shock us all. From a boy with a lisp in West Virginia to a preacher whose name is tied to billion-dollar deals, presidential circles, Hollywood films, and worldwide movements, T.D. Jakes' journey has been anything but ordinary. But with lawsuits still pending, health still fragile, and critics still circling, one question remains. What happens next? Because if there's one thing we've learned about T.D. Jakes, it's that the story is never as simple as it looks. And speaking of hidden stories, in our next video, we uncover what happened when they opened Sammy Davis Jr.'s vault after 30 years, and why everyone froze. Subscribe and stay tuned.